We always need to hear both sides of the story, in Good Intentions episode 23. And here we have the flip side of Mario Bros. Donkey Kong 3 is a sort of dead-end creative road, a line of games that would end here for a decade, whereas the Mario Bros. Games would thrive and change the medium altogether. 1981's Donkey Kong may have been named for its biggest and most impressive-looking character, but the game introduced two other characters. Poor Pauline amounted to nothing more than scenery, but Mario would ultimately become just as popular as Kong himself, and then some. I mentioned in episode 20 my admiration for Nintendo's determination not to simply crank out formulaic sequels to its biggest arcade hit to that point. Donkey Kong Jr. completely reinvented its predecessor's platforming mechanics, literally turning them sideways. You didn't really see this sort of inventiveness in the golden age of arcades. Sequels back then were about iteration rather than innovation. But there was a downside to Nintendo's decision not to go down the easy path of repetitive sequels. For a while, Shigeru Miyamoto and his team weren't entirely certain what to do with these characters they had created. We see it in Donkey Kong Jr., wherein Mario becomes a villain, replaced as protagonist by a baby monkey. Mario would find his way soon enough with Mario Bros., returning to the lead role, and not too selfish to share the limelight with his newly introduced brother, as a nimble, monster-kicking hero. Mario Bros. Also quite notably set Mario and Kong on separate paths. Rather than endlessly recycle the antagonistic rivalry between the two characters, Nintendo broke them apart and set them on different career paths. Soon enough, Mario would find his new nemesis in Bowser, the King of Koopas, while taking up the mantle of the Mushroom Kingdom's noble protector. Setting Mario apart from Donkey Kong may have been the smartest move Nintendo ever made with the characters, as it allowed the versatile plumber to live a life fully his own, separate from Donkey Kong, a character with whom Nintendo has never seemed entirely certain what to do. Because ultimately, what did Donkey Kong do? In his debut outing, he was little more than scenery, like Pauline, a mostly static object at the top of the screen who couldn't actually interact with Mario. If you moved close enough to Kong, Mario would die, but that was about the extent of Kong's interactivity. Otherwise, he just stood there and tossed barrels in the first stage, or just stood there in the rest of the game. In Donkey Kong Jr., Kong's role was diminished even more. He literally took the place of Pauline as passive decoration, becoming a prize rather than an actor. Kong's enormous on-screen size made him interesting to look at in an era where everything in arcade games consisted of tiny little sprites. But it also meant you couldn't really do anything with him. He was too big and too cumbersome to take an active role in a single-screen platformer. He simply took up too much of the screen to build interesting gameplay challenges around. I suppose Nintendo could have given Kong a role similar to that of Brutus and Popeye, but then they'd simply have been retreading their ideas with different visuals, which the company seemed averse to doing in those days. And so, while Mario became the focus of innovative new play mechanics, the flashpoint for revolutionary game concepts, Donkey Kong lurked at the top of the screen as Miyamoto and crew scratched their head and wondered, what do we do with Kong? How do you solve a problem like Donkey Kong? Well, here, with the Big Gorilla's third eponymous game, the answer turned out to be to keep him in the role of villain while changing the context of said villainy. The result is a bit of a mess. Donkey Kong 3 isn't a bad game, but it somehow manages to feel simultaneously like a throwback and overly complicated, which is a weird combination. The throwback part can be explained easily enough at least. Unlike its predecessors, Donkey Kong 3 isn't an entirely new game concept. Rather, it appears to draw on concepts and mechanics from Space FIREBIRD, one of the many Space Invaders-inspired shoot-'em-ups Nintendo peddled in arcades before striking it big with Donkey Kong. One might question the wisdom of placing Kong, the character that helped Nintendo break from the junior leagues, into a game that amounts to a retread of one of the games that saw Nintendo mired in derivative Cloneworks. Maybe the thinking here was that Kong's presence would infuse this rehash with a spark of much-needed inspiration. Or maybe Shigeru Miyamoto's real enthusiasm belonged to the interesting new concepts Mario was playing, and this was just a quick cash-in on the Kong name. Whatever the case, Donkey Kong 3 retains Kong in the role of antagonist, but replaces Mario with a new hero, a pest exterminator by the name of Stanley the Bugman. One gets the impression that Nintendo knew this wasn't its best work and decided to insulate Mario from its mediocrity. Why else replace an all-around versatile everyman like Mario with some other generic dude? Donkey Kong 3 sees the ape returning to a role similar to that of his debut. He dominates the upper third of the screen, hassling the player with a storm of descending hazards. Where this third entry differs from the previous Donkey Kong titles is in its genre. The screen contains a few platforms, yes, but this is no platformer. Donkey Kong 3, like its inspiration Space FIREBIRD, amounts to a vertical shoot-'em-up. Stanley has a little more mobility than, say, the missile base from Space Invaders, thanks to the multi-tiered structure at the bottom of the screen, but you don't leap from level to level, you just press up and down. As with Popeye, Mario's greatest and most unique asset, the jump button, has been replaced by a more standard convention, in this case, a fire button. In this light, maybe we can see Popeye's punch button as part of a deliberate pattern on Nintendo's behalf, an attempt to maintain a certain distinction for Mario by defining the character through his primary action. Mario leaps, Popeye punches, Stanley shoots. Which could also account for why Mario is on the outs here as well, since Donkey Kong 3 doesn't have a need for leaping, just shooting, which is something Mario's never really done. The game consists of 3 rounds, all set in a variety of greenhouses. In each stage, Kong clings to a pair of ropes high above the ground and kicks off the action by pummeling a pair of beehives. All at once, there's a lot happening here. Kong slowly descends the ropes, and your primary task in each stage is to prevent him from dropping to the ground, which causes you to lose a life instantly. You do this by blasting his hindquarters with Stanley's bug spray. Each puff of toxin causes Kong to scoot upward in indignation. In fact, you can't advance to the next round until you zap Kong's butt enough to push him off the top of the screen. This task in itself isn't so difficult. In fact, if you're powered up with a super spray that Kong sometimes dislodges from the vines, you can literally clear a stage in about 5 seconds. Realistically though, you're meant to manage a number of other on-screen crises as well. The beehives that Kong pummels disgorge an endless stream of bees, which swoop down and drop their stingers in what appears to be a small nod to Namco's Galaga. Harassing the players isn't really what the bees are all about though. Instead, their compound eyes are fixed firmly on the prize, that is the red flowers at the bottom of the screen, which they zip down to steal away. And similar to another Namco shooter, King and Balloon, your goal here is also to prevent the flowers from being stolen away by the bugs. You can shoot down a bee as it retreats to its hive after snatching a flower, but if you allow every flower to be completely stolen, it's a game over. To make things even more difficult, a bee that manages to bring a flower back to the hive gets an upgrade to a faster, more aggressive form. Not unlike the mutants and Defender stealing humans, really. You also have to contend with queen bees, which soak up an extra hit before going down, and once you do manage to kill a queen, it explodes in a spray of shrapnel that can easily take out Stanley as collateral damage. There's more though. Indestructible caterpillars will slowly crawl down toward the platforms that Stanley patrols, and while you can stun them, their presence obstructs Stanley's bug blasts. Meanwhile, butterflies and beetles will target Stanley directly, attacking from the sides of the screen. Other enemies will attack more randomly, or even attempt to chew through the ropes suspending Kong above the action to hasten his plummet to the bottom of the screen. The game translates to NES fairly well, though as with the original Donkey Kong, the difference between arcade and TV screen orientations causes the original vertical play space to become somewhat compressed in a horizontal area. The home conversion also loses a few of the arcade version's more advanced elements, most notably the plants that attempt to eat through Kong's vines. It's a fast-paced and frantic game, and as a sequel to Space Firebird, it's pretty impressive. As a sequel to Donkey Kong though, it feels a little misaimed. Aside from the presence of Kong himself, whose interest in the greenhouse makes practically zero sense, there's very little connective tissue between this and the previous games. You really get the impression that Nintendo is casting about for something, anything to do with the Kong character, and this is the best they could come up with. Perhaps not surprisingly then, this would be the last we'd see of Donkey Kong for a decade. Aside from co-starring in the obscure Game & Watch Donkey Kong hockey unit, and an appearance in Hudson's weird Donkey Kong 3 sequel for PC 8801, Kong would vanish altogether until 1994's Donkey Kong for Game Boy. He didn't even get to appear in Super Mario Kart, with that honor instead going to his son. It wasn't though he was totally forgotten, however. Again, Nintendo intended to bring Kong back, seemingly as the playable character, in an NES game called Return of Donkey Kong. But after spending a couple of years on the NES Coming Soon lists, that game quietly vanished, and no one has ever been able to determine what precisely the game was intended to be. So here we have a weird swan song of sorts for Nintendo's original breakout star, released on the NES day and date with the game that made him a star in the first place. Things moved faster in the early days of gaming, but even so, this is a pretty remarkable case. Anyway, from here on out, it was all about Mario, who, incidentally, was starring in the second Super Mario Bros. Game over in Japan right around the time that Donkey Kong 3 hit the US market. That seems like a pretty neat and tidy way to close the book on the NES adventures of Donkey Kong, don't you think? Next on Good Intentions, it gets worse before it gets better.